He is a PhD student at UBC. He's working at Christoff's lab, and he's going to talk to you about mind wandering and dreaming. So let's welcome him.
How's the sound? Loud. Yeah, so my name's Kieran. Thanks a lot to Maya and Thackeray. I'll just start right away and say that for organizing everything, for inviting me to talk, and to Ben Bogart, who actually made the invitation to me to come. And I want to talk to you about my research on dreaming and mind wandering at UBC. I really like this painting. It's Vladimir Kush. He's inspired by Dali, obviously. But I realized I probably should have chosen other cover art to kind of have this Don Quixote figure down there. I'm about to tell you about my research program, but I'm priming everyone with associations of this crazy guy on some delusional quest. And that's not really what I want to do. But I'll just jump into it anyway. Most of what I'm going to talk about is based on this paper we published earlier this summer. And basically in the paper we're arguing that dreaming can be considered very similar to mind wandering or daydreaming. I'll use those terms interchangeably. Or that maybe they're even 2 points on a single continuum of some kind of creative, fantasy-like mental process. And there's two main lines of evidence that support this argument. And the first one was that we reviewed the literature on the subjective aspects of dreams and daydreams. So first-person content reports, and we compared those to one another. And second, we conducted meta-analyses of the functional neuroimaging data, and we're trying to look at whether the patterns of brain activity, activation and deactivation are similar across daydreaming and dreaming. And the short version of what we found, which is what you're going to be hearing today, is that yes, from both the subjective and the neurophysiological viewpoints, there is a great deal of overlap between daydreaming and dreaming. But yeah, if you think this story sounds a little bit too good to be true, you're right, it is. There's not enough time really to get into all the details and to qualify all the results. But if you want the messy version with all the qualifications, you can look into the paper. So before I get into what we did, I want to talk a little bit about why we would study dreams and daydreams. And I find you don't really need to justify this to most people. Generally, when you talk to the average person, you tell them you're doing dream research, they're really excited about it. They love it, they want to hear about your research, they want to tell you about your dreams. And no matter how hard you try to tell them what the research is actually like, they just don't believe you, and they project this image of what you're doing, and they want you to interpret their dreams for them, and so on. So you don't have to justify this to most people. There's a certain subset of people, though, some other people who do want you to justify your work, explain why it's important to society, and they're never really convinced that it's worthwhile. And unfortunately, they have a similar perception to the average person of what dream researchers are doing. But I will say that one good reason, I think, to study dreams and daydreams is simply because historically and scientifically, they've been enormously influential. And so one really well-known example is Auguste Kekulé, who discovered the benzene ring, which is kind of the beginning of all organic chemistry. He's a huge figure in the history of chemistry. And what's interesting is that he credited a dream with the inspiration of his discovery of this circular ring structure for benzene. And he wrote, he wrote, "I turned my chair to the fire and dozed. Again, the atoms were gambling before my eyes. But look, what was that? One of the snakes had seized hold of its own tail, and the form whirled mockingly before my eyes. As if by a flash of lightning I awoke. And this time also I spent the rest of the night working out the consequences of the hypothesis." And he continued, "Let us learn to dream, gentlemen, and perhaps we shall find the truth." But he closed with some good advice, I think, for academics, which was to let us beware of publishing our dreams until they've been tested by the waking understanding. Which I think is a good point. And I think it's worth noting that he didn't have these ideas out of the blue. He was deeply immersed in this kind of research at the time. So what's interesting is the content of his dreams reflected what was going on in his daily life, his daily scientific work. And then his dreams, in turn, provided raw material for his scientific work to proceed along those lines. And I think it's also notable that he insists on rigorously checking these inspirations you get from dreams and daydreams. And I'll come back to both those ideas later on dreams also feature really heavily in the origins of the religions that are currently prevalent throughout society, throughout the world. A key point in the origin of Islam, for example, was Muhammad's so-called night journey, and this is where he falls asleep and dreams of being taken to speak with God by the angel Gabriel. And this encounter really strengthens his confidence that he really is a messenger and that he should spread the religion of Islam. And similarly, the story goes that the Buddha didn't really want to teach either. So after his enlightenment, he had no interest in really telling anybody about it or trying to help other people get there, until he had this visionary, dreamlike encounter with the god Brahma, who convinced him that he should actually go out and teach what we now call Buddhism. So it seems like nearly everyone in the world has been affected by even these three dreams, never mind other dreams. And it's a separate issue, I think, whether you consider these to be positive developments. So I know a lot of people have strong feelings, including myself, about organized religion, and probably about organic chemistry as well. But these are undeniably influential things in our world, no matter how you look at it. And so those are, of course, extreme examples of really creative or really inspirational dreams. But what about people's everyday dreams and daydreams? Well, you can just ask people about the subjective content and see what they've been thinking about or what they've been dreaming about. And most people's dreams are not as exciting as Kepler's, obviously. If you think organic chemistry is exciting anyway. So one example of one of these studies of the subjective content is here. This is a pie chart from Jess Andrews-Hanna, who was at Harvard, I think, when she did this study. And what it's showing, this is from hundreds of content reports of different people, just during regular daytime thoughts and daydreams. And what it shows, the pieces of the pie chart are showing the proportion of thoughts that are dedicated to certain topics or certain time periods. And what you can see, I'm not sure how visible it is up there, but what you can see if you zoom in on it is that about 40% of all the thoughts and daydreams we have are related to yesterday, today, or tomorrow. And about half of these, so about 20% of all the daydreams and thoughts you have are about today. So you can't really see people who are living in the moment, but they're pretty close. And so a lot of these thoughts are just centering around what's happening in your life right now, like the last 24 hours or so. And what we did was to compile dozens of studies like this of subjective content, looking not just at the time period, but the sensory aspects, emotion, all that kind of stuff, put them all together, and then we try to draw some general conclusions. And that's the first part of the paper we published. And what we came up with, if you summarize all this stuff, is that the average daydream is moderately visual. There's some visual aspects to it, maybe some visual imagery. Whereas the average nighttime dream is pretty much always a strong visual component. Likewise for sound, self-narrative, imagined vocal exchanges, imagined conversations, and so on. This is pretty prevalent in daytime daydreaming and also in nighttime dreams. You also see that affect or emotion is a really common aspect. About 70% of reports in daydreams and dreams. And that can be positive or negative or anything in between. And simulation of social interactions is also a really common feature. And just generally the content relates very strongly to your current concerns, your current goals in life, recent events that are important to you. And I think the two things to notice here, one is the broad similarity, which is the point of the paper. What we're arguing is that the content and the subjective aspects are very similar in both states. And another is that this content is similar to the rest of your waking life, which supports this idea that basically what you're dreaming about and what you're daydreaming about is what's happening in your life. So it's not just fantasy and it's not just useless stuff, which is what some people might argue. And a more difficult question, though, is about the neurophysiological aspects of dreams and daydreams, because you can't just ask people about that. And the question is, do they share any similarities as well? And to compare the two, we obviously need to know what are the neural bases of dreaming and daydreaming. And currently nobody has a great understanding of that, at least of all me. But what we did for the paper is look at what I call plausible preliminary proxies. So what we're trying to look at is brain states that the research suggests that we think are closely associated with the subjective states of dreaming and daydreaming. And what we come up with is that daydreaming or mind wandering has been pretty closely associated with the default mode network activity in this network of regions, which I'll get into in a moment, what that is. And for dreaming, there's a very tight correlation with REM sleep, or rapid eye movement sleep, which most people have probably heard of before. And again, the story isn't this simple. There's a lot of qualifications and potential problems with this, and we discuss that in the paper. But overall, we think this is a pretty justified simplification. So the default mode network has an interesting history. It's a serendipitous discovery, which means it was just good luck, basically, that they found it. And then they published the results in PNAS, and now it's been cited 4,000 times or so. So that was my PhD plan, serendipitous discoveries, but that didn't work, so I'm doing this instead. And all it really is, there's some confusion about it, but all it really is a group of regions that are more active when you're doing nothing, or when you're just at rest in a brain scanner, as opposed to when you're doing a task. And that came out of the original research where they looked at some kind of task and then they compared it to a baseline. And the baseline was always just people sitting in the scanner, doing nothing. So it turns out you're not just doing nothing, you're daydreaming, or thinking about your future and calling up memories, past associations, and so on most of that time. So these regions become interesting in themselves in terms of them being more active when you're at rest, because this might be a plausible neural basis for daydreaming and future planning and so on. And that's a contrast analysis, so that's looking at the resting state greater than a variety of executive tasks thrown together. You can also look at it in terms of functional connectivity. I don't have time to really get into this, but basically you're just looking at temporal correlation between activity in different regions of the brain. And what you find if you look at functional connectivity analyses in the resting state, the map is very similar to default regions you find when you compare resting state to executive tasks. So because there are these multiple ways of looking at the default network, it's not so easy just to define what regions constitute the default mode network. And this is showing multiple different ways of looking at it, and then the white spots at the bottom are the convergence across different methods. And so luckily, Randy Buckner's group at Harvard has done a lot of the hard work for me already, and this table comes out when they've analyzed all the different studies and different ways of looking at default network. This is kind of the list of regions you get, and these are probably familiar to many of you. The important things to note, I guess, are the midline cortical structures, medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, inferior parietal lobule, laterally, and then the hippocampal formation, which is where they think a lot of the memory sources are coming from. So hippocampus, perihippocampus, and entorhinal cortex. And then the next question, if you want to compare this with dreaming, would be what's the neural basis of dreaming? And so we're using REM sleep as a proxy. The correlation again is about 0.8, so roughly 80% of the reports, or sorry, roughly 80% of the time when you awaken someone from REM sleep, they'll have a dream report. And there's no really good answer to this so far because no one has done this difficult meta-analytic work that Randy Buckner's group did for default network and resting state. And there aren't that many studies of sleep either because it's hard to get people to sleep in the scanner. But when you don't have an answer to this kind of question, you can do some voodoo called meta-analysis. And that's kind of how it feels when you're doing it, although I think it makes more sense in the end. And that's what we did. That's one of the major new things in the paper of our contributions. We did this meta-analysis and sorted through the data. And we used a technique that's called activation likelihood estimation, or ALE. And it's implemented in software called Ginger Ale. And it's a quantitative meta-analytic method. And basically all it does is it takes all the peak foci of activation or difference from the primary literature, you throw that all into the meta-analysis, and then it comes out with regions of overlap. So if there's a bunch of studies that show medial prefrontal cortex is active in REM sleep, that's going to come out in the meta-analysis as a significant cluster. Whereas if there's results that are kind of scattered around, those are going to get washed out as noise. And it will give you statistical thresholds telling you how reliable it thinks each one of these clusters are. Yeah, I just said that basically. And what you come up with in the end, and this is a figure straight from our paper on the right, is the meta-analytic clusters of REM sleep, which we're using as our proxy for dreaming. The red-orange are activations, the blue-green are the activations. I find for comparison, though, it's a lot easier to just show a table of this, so I'm just going to skip ahead to that. The images look nicer, but it's harder to see what's going on. And so if you compare, this is the original table I just showed you of default mode network regions, And on the right, this is a listing of all our significant meta-analytic clusters. And the bold numbers, that's the most important thing. I don't know if those are obvious, so I'll just show them. In here, I don't know, can you guys see the difference between the bold? Yeah. So the bold numbers are regions that overlap with the default mode network regions on the left over here. And it's not highlighted that much more because they all overlap, essentially. So every meta-analytic cluster we found in the meta-analysis overlaps, at least to some extent, with a key region of the default network, according to an independent group's analysis of what's in the default network. And there's also some regions that, some of the clusters extend beyond those regions as well. So you can see there's also areas that are not in bold. So that's where a cluster extends into another brain region. And I don't want to speculate a lot here about the functional contributions of each region, but a very general model developed by Jessica Andrews-Hanna and Randy Buckner at Harvard would be that in the hippocampal formation, pairing hippocampus and entorhinal cortex, this is where you're tapping into long-term memory, and this is where you're getting new ideas, new scenarios in dreams or daydreams. And the posterior cingulate might come into function to retrieve that information, bring it up into neocortex, and then with the medial prefrontal areas are contributing a sort of global framework for this information. So they're putting it into a self-referential framework where you relate these new ideas or these new potential scenarios to your own goals, your concept of yourself, and you check whether the ideas that have been thrown out by your daydreams or dreams are actually relevant to you or if they're useful to you in some way. And so we think these subjective and neuroscience are really intriguing. We think there's a lot of interesting overlap here, but we're also not trying to claim that they're the same thing, either subjectively or neurally. And there's definitely important differences, which we discuss a lot in the paper, and it's buried at the end somewhere. But I'll highlight just a few of them here. For one thing, when you're dreaming, you're obviously lying in bed asleep. And when you're daydreaming, according to Google Image anyway, all the images come up like this. You're sitting with your head in your hands and gazing off into the distance. So there's different levels of arousal, different physical postures. And that's obvious. It's an obvious difference. But it has important implications with respect to, for example, rhythmicity. So we know that daydreaming doesn't occur totally randomly throughout the day. So there's certain things that will cause you to daydream more or increase the rate of daydreaming. So if you're doing something you're really good at, a well-practiced task, for example, you will daydream more because you don't need resources to think about what you're actually doing. And maybe if you're listening to a really boring lecture, you might also start daydreaming more. So in general, what we think it would look like if you have a graph of the rate of mind wandering or daydreaming throughout the day is that it would be largely dependent on your moods and on the events that are happening to you, how well practiced the things you're doing are, how boring they are. And so this could be an average day with the rate of daydreaming going up and down. And so maybe when you get to work in the morning, you start spacing out instantly. Maybe you actually get some work done, but then after lunch, there's a little peak. And then after a full day of work, you decide it's a good idea to come to a lecture on dreaming and mind wandering, and you peak again. So, and again, so while we don't think this is totally random throughout the day, it's probably quite unpredictable. It's probably not a very regular process. And these aren't real data, by the way. This is just, I think it's really stock prices or something. Just found it online. It makes sense. But sleep, on the other hand, occurs in very regular cycles. It's a very regular process. Probably not for grad students or medical residents, but for normal people, sleep is a very regular cyclic phenomenon. It's the well-known circadian rhythms. And even within sleep, there's also regular rhythms, especially REM sleep recurs regularly. So the dark blue bars are periods of REM sleep. And you can see not only that they recur regularly, about every 90 minutes, but also that they get increasingly longer throughout the night. And that's, I mean, again, this is an idealization, but this is very well established from 60 or 70 years ago now. And another important difference is the well-known differences in the neurochemistry between sleep and waking. And I should mention that this is a pretty controversial model, but it is the leading model, which is the AIM model, or AIM model from Alan Hobson and Bob Stickles' group. They're at Harvard. And what they basically suggest is that in normal waking thought, norepinephrine and serotonin levels are high compared to dreaming from REM sleep. whereas when you're dreaming, acetylcholine levels are higher than during waking. And this is normal waking thought, not daydreaming per se. And it would be really interesting to see, for me, if the neurochemistry of daydreaming during the day is some hybrid between these two, or if it's similar, more similar to the dreaming neurochemistry. But as far as I know, no one has looked at this in humans. If you know of anything like that, I'd love to hear about it. And the last difference I want to talk about is perhaps the difference of intensity. And this is the argument we make in our paper, which is that some of the differences you see can be explained on this continuum, where dreaming is a more intense form of daytime mind wandering. And this is probably about as simple a model of mental functioning as you could possibly make, but we still put it in the paper regardless. So the solid lines represent the subjective aspects. So the blue is the audiovisual imagery, the extent of that, green being bizarreness or fantasy, and then the dashed or dotted lines are brain activity levels as measured by fMRI or PET scans, and you have two of those as well. So the red is the default mode network activity, and yellow the prefrontal cortex regions. And what you see, this is what we argue in the paper, and I think the evidence supports this when we put it all together, is that on the far left you have a normal goal-directed waking thought, going to school, giving a lecture maybe, and you see that there's not a lot of audiovisual imagery, bizarreness, fantasy, and so on. These are all suppressed. Default mode network activity is low or suppressed, and activity in prefrontal cortex regions is high. And then when you move into the middle, with daydreaming, we call it figures from the paper, so we call it spontaneous thought in the paper because it sounds fancier, but we're just talking about daydreaming. So we propose that daydreaming is kind of a hybrid state where all these features are moderate levels. So there's some audiovisual imaging creeping in, there's sort of bizarre associations in the thought, default mode network regions are showing more activity, prefrontal cortex regions are generally suppressed, and then dreaming becomes the more extreme version where prefrontal cortex is basically at an all-time low, whereas audiovisual imagery, bizarreness, fantasy, and default network activity are all at the highest levels. And so I want to start wrapping up the talk by again getting into why I think dreams and daydreams might be important, and what are the possible functions of dreaming and daydreaming, if any. And if you start reading this literature, you see that everyone has a theory on this. But I'll just focus on just one, and which we tried to develop in our recent papers. And it's called the selectionist theory of creativity and insight, most famously propounded by Donald Campbell, who's at UChicago. And basically what it argues is that the brain is looking for the proverbial needle in the haystack. It throws together all kinds of crazy, implausible ideas during daydreams and dreams, and it's basically hoping, although we don't want to use that terminology, but it's just trying to come up with something that might be useful or relevant to your daily life, or your future plans and so on. And there's a really interesting analogy here, which Campbell draws on to ecology. And ecologists can lump most species into one of two broad categories, R strategists or K strategists. And R strategists, the classic example is oysters. So they reproduce a lot, they reproduce very quickly, most of the offspring don't survive, and even if they do survive, they don't live very long. So it's basically a quantity over quality kind of approach to life, where you throw out tons of offspring with a lot of genetic variation, and you sort of hope for the best. K strategists, on the other hand, are like us, or whales, and it's the opposite. We have very few offspring, we invest a lot of resources, those offspring grow very slowly, and we hope that they survive to old age and can reproduce themselves. And so the idea for the brain, for dreaming and daydreaming, is that maybe the brain works in a similar way to an R strategist when it comes to creativity, planning for the future, imagining potential social situations, and so on, where it generates a lot of ideas, and it does it very quickly, but most of them don't survive because they're not viable. And a question arises, obviously, is that then what's the selective force? Because you don't have this natural environment. What's choosing between different daydreams or dreams and picking out what's actually interesting to you or valuable for your life? And what we think, what we're arguing in a book chapter that's coming out soon, is that in the ideal situation metacognitive and executive brain regions in the prefrontal cortex would come into play to evaluate the information or the ideas being generated during dreams or daydreams, which are not all of equal value to you. And there's actually some data to support this, so it's not just us theorizing out of the blue. This is an example from a study in our lab by my lab named Melissa Ellermill a couple of years ago. And she was studying creativity, so she brought a bunch of students in from Emily Carr University, a bunch of visual arts students. She had them basically create art in one stage, and then she had them evaluate their own art in a second stage. This is all going on in the fMRI scanner. And what you can see in the top panel is the generation stage. And you can see that during generation of creative ideas, key areas of default network, like the hippocampus and the inferior parietal lobule, are active. And then in the second panel, at the bottom, this is the evaluation when they're evaluating their own work. You see additional recruitment of executive and metacognitive regions like dorsal anterior cingulate, rostrolateral, and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And this next image is showing very similar results, but here, instead of using contrast of one stage to another, so generation versus evaluation, we're doing functional connectivity analysis, similar to how people were defining the default network in the slides I showed you earlier. And so basically we're using the executive or metacognitive regions as the seeds, and then trying to look at what other regions in the brain show activity that's correlated with these regions over time. And what you see in both cases, the top panel is the dorsal anterior cingulate as a seed, and the bottom panel is DLPSC as a seed. And in both cases, you see that the executive regions show strong functional connectivity with a bunch of default network regions. So it looks like what's happening is that when you're evaluating your own work, metacognitive regions are talking to these default regions that created the ideas in the first place. And so the default regions are offering up these ideas, and the PSC is telling them the harsh truth, and this is not a good piece of art. And it's basically keeping the default network in line and making sure that the ideas are actually viable. And speaking of harsh critiques of wild ideas, I'll just end by thanking my mentors and supervisors and collaborators who keep me in line when I'm coming up with this stuff. Tori Nielsen was my undergraduate supervisor for dream research. Christoff, my current supervisor. Lisa Solmanova and Bill Domoff, collaborators on the paper. I've been talking about this whole time. And Savannah Najibor is my amazing RA. Is also on this paper with us. And also, thanks very much to Brain Talks, Bakary, Maya, for inviting me to speak. And, oh yeah, aren't I ungrateful? I was mocking NSERC earlier, but they actually are funding me very generously. So I'm very appreciative, actually, of that. And I think Ben Bogart's going to pick up where I left off now. So thanks very much.
Is this on? Oh, that's it. So after Ben finishes speaking, then both Karen and Ben will come up and receive questions. So you'll be able to ask them questions about the talk. So now I'm going to introduce Ben Bogart. He is also a candidate for a PhD, and he's at the School for Interactive Art and Technology at Simon Fraser University. He is going to present on some big worded topics that I can't remember right now, but basically meta machine systems. He's also an artist, and that's how I met Ben. He creates works of art that are interactive. And the one I saw him do was one that was involved in replicating dreaming using a machine. So it's quite interesting. So let's welcome Ben.
Thank you, everyone. Bear with me, getting the switch over. So, IBN, or the research area that the Metacreation Agents and Multi-Agent Systems Lab does, is really centered around, oh, that's interesting. I didn't write it in. It's centered around the fairly new and perhaps controversial area of machine creativity. How can we use artificial intelligence methods and computational methods to make creative machines? And so that is the context in which this work exists. And at the same time, I am an artist, and I'd like to acknowledge the support of the the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, who funded my PhD research in dreaming. So, since the theme is to start with an image that we might culturally consider dreamlike or bizarre, I'd like to start talking about how I see as an artist the cultural baggage we have around dreams and how it makes it very hard, even scientifically, to get at what actually is going on in the dream mechanism. So we have this kind of hallucinatory or dreamlike attachment to surrealism, where melting clocks and all this bizarreness is really so ingrained in our culture that it's hard for us to think about what a dream could be that's not bizarre. And I think that's quite problematic and interesting. And one example of that, feeding off the appearance talk, is that for a really long time it was thought that dreams only happened in REM sleep and didn't happen at all in non-REM sleep. And part of that discontinuity actually came from how the question was asked. So if you ask, after waking up dream studies participants, what were they dreaming, then they might give you one answer. And if you wake them up from non-REM sleep dreaming and ask them what they're dreaming, they might say, I wasn't dreaming anything. But if you ask them, what were they thinking, what did they remember, what was their last experience, then all of a sudden things change a little. Just attaching the label of dreaming to an experience already clouds it, turns it into something else. And so another weird little anecdote in the world of dream content analysis is back in the 60s and 50s, it was actually thought that dreams were always in black and white. That happened to align perfectly with the popularity of black and white television. Pretty much everybody had black and white television at that period of time, and at the same time, it was quite unusual. Obviously, daily experience was always in color. And, but very few dream reports actually contained any color. And then around in the late 60s and the 70s, color all of a sudden became important. And there's a really interesting paper about why did we think this in the first place. And so whether you understand, well, nobody really understands why that was thought, but papers were published about black and whiteness of dreams at that period. It does seem to be something about how our cultural artifacts are constructed and how they permeate our lives that impact what our dreams are. So I'm going to be discussing a theory that integrates visual mentation and spontaneous creativity on one hand, and also a computational artwork. So to start with the theory, what on earth do I actually mean by visual mentation? So it's a very broad definition where I'm meaning the experience from the first person's perspective of visual images in the mind. So including perception, that is the awareness of external visual stimulus, mental imagery, and I'm also including the recall of visual images from memory, mind wandering, and dreaming in this conception of visual mentation. So the contribution is, again, integrative theory, and then the computational model. So the computational model is building a computer program that manifests and formalizes some aspects of the theory. So the theory itself is much more broad, and I think it applies to human cognition, whereas the computational model is much more restricted and is more oriented towards an artistic practice. And is contextualized within a series of site-specific artworks, which you can read about in a recent Leonardo article. Let me know if you're interested afterwards. So clearly there's something in between art and science that I'm talking about here, and part of that relationship for me is being able to expand ideas around neuroscience and cognition into broader contexts, into artistic contexts, and at the same time take cultural and humanities understandings and perspectives and how those can be applied and also exploited in harder neuroscience types of disciplines. So I'm going to be talking about first the dual process of creativity, which is similar to something Karen mentioned earlier. I'm going to talk about how we can consider dreaming like perception, how we can consider dreaming like mental imagery or imagination, dreaming as mind wandering. Then I'm going to talk about my integrative theory that tries to sum up a lot of the stuff. Then a little bit of a discussion on the computational model, and if that all works out, then I can get into the hopefully really interesting stuff, the work in progress that has not been published yet. So in 2004, a teacher wrote this really interesting paper about dual processes of creativity. And I kept thinking about that during Kieran's talk, especially when we're talking about creativity and generation and evaluation. So Dietrich actually has 4 modes of creativity. One half is emotional creativity, and another half is more rational creativity. That's not quite right, but you can ask me about it later. And so on the non-emotional side, we have a separation of spontaneous and deliberate modes of processing. And it's important to note at this point that these two things, we can't actually consider the results of any one of them as being creative. That they're actually both so intertwined that creativity can only exist in a relationship between them, not in either in isolation. So one example of spontaneous processing could be musical improvisation. You're not pre-planning what you're going to do, you're just doing whatever occurs to your brain and your muscles first. And so in spontaneous creativity, we have associative activity in the temporal, occipital, and parietal cortices. We'll see an image of that afterwards. And these areas hold high-level abstract perceptual representations, according to Dietrich. So the main characteristics of spontaneous creativity is that they are random, unfiltered, and bizarre. Remember bizarre, it'll come in handy later. And they're also unconstrained by consciousness. That is, you don't have to be aware of what's actually happening in spontaneous creativity. It's actually happening in your brain subconsciously, for lack of a better term. Then we have deliberate creativity, where you have something more like musical composition. And so in deliberate creativity, you're talking about a goal-oriented refinement and planning that's associated with the executive functions that Kieran already talked about in the prefrontal cortex. And we can describe these as structured, rational, and conformist. And when I say conformist, I mean that they tend to match social norms. And by definition, that makes them somewhat conservative. They fit well in the world, they're not dangerous or bizarre. And deliberate creativity is constrained by consciousness because you're actually thinking through a process and trying to manifest that process. So the colored regions are these top cortices, a few of these high-level perceptual representations, and then a little piece in the front is that prefrontal cortex, which is also part of the default network, which I'll talk a little bit more later. So Dietrich made this claim about the relationship between spontaneous creativity and dreaming in saying that dreaming might be regarded as the most extreme form of the spontaneous processing mode and can give rise to insights that are difficult to come by during normal waking consciousness. So there are cases like Ketuvay's benzene ring, exactly, where perhaps that notion of this ring structure wouldn't have occurred through a deliberate process, that without some kind of impetus that was bizarre or nonconformist, that idea maybe could have never ever risen. So there is some value in being nonconformist in a social way, and perhaps the only way of being truly creative is also being disconnected to some degree by evaluation. So on to dreaming. So the AIM theory of dreaming, which Kieran also referred to, was originally titled Activation Synthesis Theory in 1977, and we can consider it very simply as a super simplified abstraction that we're talking about the random activation of early sensory areas from a part of the brain stem, which is a very low-level aspect of the brain. And so the idea of that one is that this is dreaming as perception. That is, we have activity happening in the sensory cortex, and that sensory cortex is made sense of by other parts of the brain, so we're seeing our dreams the same way we would see external stimulus. So a counterpoint to that is a proposal by Neuroscience, which was written in 2010, that maybe dreams aren't like perception, maybe they're more like imagination. What if we look at this from the other side? So if we think about dreams as imagination, then we're talking about the activation of high-level abstract perceptual representations. And those representations, rather than the early sort of sensory regions that Hobson is talking about. And maybe those are directly activated. So there is no role of early cortex in dreams as imagination. What we have is a more direct activation of conceptually oriented brain regions. And so Neuroscience talk about imagination, but they don't explicitly cite any specific theory of imagination. So they do cite Kostelin's. I'm using Kostelin's theory here, where perceptual anticipation is the act of making mental images by rendering encoded representations in the temporal lobe that is part of the top cortex. and using those encoded representations to render an image into early visual cortex. So basically, something like what is happening in Hobson's model, we have an image in the early visual cortex that's constructed from high-level representations. So for Hobson, we have the brainstem, which is producing these random PGO waves, and they go to lots of places, including the occipital cortex, which is where the visual center is. And then that visual center is interpreted using the same mechanisms as normal external perception. Whereas for neuroscience and Hobson, we have this opposite kind of directionality, if we can buy directionality in the brain, which in itself is quite problematic. So we have these high-level abstract representations in the temporal lobe, and we're going to render those into the early visual cortex, and then we'll be able to see them the same way we see the external world. So this is getting really redundant with Kieran's talk, or really complementary. So at this point, I'm just going to use a few quotes that Don Hoff, who was actually one of the co-authors of Kieran's paper, talks about how we can rethink this bizarreness aspect of dreams. And so in another paper from 2011, he cites Snyder, which was written in 1970, who's describing dream reports. And he says that dream reports tend to be clear, coherent, and detailed accounts of a realistic situation involving the dreamer and other people caught up in very ordinary activities. So maybe dreams aren't this bizarre thing that we're culturally trained to think of dreams as. Maybe they're a little bit more close on that kind of content, first-person experience level to normal waking consciousness. And then in that same paper, he also says that the studies of mind wandering, although mind wandering we could consider as somewhat connected to normal waking consciousness, perhaps less bizarre than dreams, have been found in laboratory studies to be, in terms of content, perhaps just as fragmented and unusual as dreams are. So dreams and mind wandering get close together. And we don't really need to notice too much about the prefrontal cortex and top regions, but as Kieran mentioned, there tends to be more volition and self-reflection in waking than there is in non-lucid dreaming and mind wandering. And in dreaming and mind wandering, there's a lot of associative thought. A little bit about the default mode network, which Kieran also talked about. I wanted to note that it is active in mind wandering, obviously, but also when you're imagining yourself in the past or future. And so the regions associated with the default network are also associated with dreaming, as Kieran mentioned. And another little tidbit is that some of those regions are active through the transition from waking to sleeping, not necessarily to dreaming, but into sleep. So this idea of portions of the default mode network are active throughout the transition between waking and sleeping. So for Daumhoff, dreams can be seen as the unique and more fully developed form of mind wandering, and therefore the quintessential cognitive stimulation, the ultimate way that we can imagine a potential, plausible reality could be in our dreams. So function is hard to separate from neuroscience, so we're always really interested in what could the function of these things be. And so one of the proposals for the function of dreaming and mind wandering is prediction. And so Hobson states that dreams could provide a virtual reality model of the world that is of functional use for the development and maintenance of waking consciousness. What he's really saying there is actually that cognitive interactions with this virtual world in your mind could actually allow self to arise. That you actually gain a sense of self by interacting in this virtual world produced in your own mind. Very interesting idea. And for Schooler, there's also this thought that mind wandering itself could provide autobiographical predictions necessary to navigate the complex social world. Even in computer science and robotics, we have this idea that if you have an internal model, then you can learn from the internal model and practice things that would be too dangerous to do in the real world. And there's a whole camp of dreaming theory that is around the whole purpose of dreaming is threat simulation alone. So the ultimate perfect dream is a nightmare because it prepares you for possible dangerous and life-threatening situations in real life without actually experiencing the danger part. So to summarize all of that, we've got Dietrich on one side, who says that spontaneous creativity involves the unconscious associative processing of abstract representations in the top cortex, and that dreaming is an extreme form of spontaneous creativity. Then we have Hobson that says that dreams are simulations of reality created by random activation of sensory cortex. Neurons and anything that dreaming is similar to mental imagery or imagination. Hobson believes that mental images are rendered in early visual cortex from high-level representations in the temporal lobe. And finally, for Delahon, dreaming is an extreme form of mind wandering and also enabled by a subset of the default mode network. So, on to the integrative interpretation. So this is a way of looking at all of that theory and trying to integrate it into one solid conception. So according to this one piece, 3 hypotheses are made. The first is that mental images, perception, and dreams, that is, all the aspects of visual mentation, all result from the activation of the same high-level sensory representations in the temporal lobe. So in that one, well, I'll go to the next one. Second is the experience of dream results from the activation of those same regions. And that is significant because it's rejecting both Kosslin and Hobson by saying that there is no functional role of early visual cortex or early sensory cortex in dreaming or mind wandering or mental imagery, but there is in perception, obviously. And the experience of those images is not from images in early visual cortex, but in activations in other brain regions, long-term memory representations in the temporal lobe. And 3, simulation prediction are key to all aspects of visual mentation and spontaneous creativity. So if we think about external perception, and we have these images perceived from our eyes that end up in our early visual cortex, which is part of the back, and then that is made sense of using normal visual mechanisms, and that causes activations in longer-term memory and associative perceptual cortex and the temporal lobe. Those activations could be used in spontaneous creativity. These insight moments of eureka are the idea that the output of the spontaneous mode injects itself into waking memory, into consciousness. So that's what that arrow does. And then the deliberate creativity is about exploiting those representations and mechanisms through deliberate, methodical action and creativity. Then we have mind wandering and dreaming, which could be somehow the direct activation of regions in the temporal lobe itself, obviously connected with the other aspects of the default mode network, which I didn't fully deal with at this point in the theory. So what is this artwork I keep talking about? So this is an exhibition that was exactly last year, around the same time, for the New Formals Festival. And so it was my first attempt to really seriously try and implement some of these ideas in the system. At that point, the system was really oriented towards the perceptual aspect of how can this thing even make sense of the world enough that it can build a repository of material from which a dream could actually arise. So most of that residency was about how I can look at this, basically how I can, so in this image there's a live camera that was pointed out into the parking lot. And that live camera pointing into the parking lot was capturing images over time. And then there's a computer vision algorithm that breaks those individual frames into pieces. And then there's some other processing that tries to make sense of those pieces. So you have the idea of a persistence of objects over time and so on. And so there's a bunch of prints you can see in the back wall here that are just collections of that same material, but collapsed in time in various ways. And I was just exploring what are the aesthetic variability and range possible when you're really just looking at a photorealistic individual camera image as the source material. And then there was an associated mechanism that allowed the dream, which was a live generative video happening in the projection there. And I have a video, but I'm not sure we're going to have time to see. So the key aspects of the system, and these all are also inherited from, and there is also a companion paper that goes with this, that explains everything in more detail. But one of the key attributes of the system are a gating of external stimulus, and this comes directly from Hobson's AIM theory of dreaming. There are these shared representations, the ones that are in use in perception, mind wandering, and dreaming. And we have 3 perception, mind wandering, and dreaming are all contiguous. That one's really significant. So according to that, I'm saying that they are not totally separate, isolated mechanisms, but they are part of a continuum. And that means that they can be smoothly flowed from one to the other. So they're different modulations of the same mechanisms, I would say. And so this system is oriented completely towards this aspect of the spontaneous side of Dietrich's creativity separation. And so there is no analog of a prefrontal cortex, there are no goals, there is no deliberate methodical creativity, therefore there is no real creativity in Dietrich's eyes and probably a lot of creativity researchers. But there is this spontaneous, unconstrained, erupting, generative thing happening. And so what controls the state if there's no consciousness or no goal or intention? And that's a circadian clock. So like our sleep and waking stages are entrained by visual stimulus, the same thing would happen to the system. So the system has 3 different states: a perception state, a dreaming state, and a mind-wandering state. In the perception, most of the activation of these shared high-level representations comes from external stimulus, whereas in dreaming, the majority of activation of these abstract representations comes from endogenous, that is internal activation. And that actual mechanism of associative activation is the propagation of activation in feature space, which basically means things that appear to be similar to the system are more likely to cause activations between each other. And finally, mind wandering is some kind of a fusion of perception and dreaming, where you have activation of those same representations, some of which are due to external stimulus, and some of which are endogenous. And so in real mind wandering, we tend to de-emphasize external stimulus. I haven't worked out how that would work in the system quite yet. So, I'm trying back. Might be a bit tense. So that was all the published stuff. Now this is the unpublished stuff that is more interesting to me, but more problematic and complex and strange. And so hopefully this will just push things in a different direction. So Dietrich really talks about the spontaneous association kind of processing happening in top cortex. And I'm starting to think about what would it mean if we were to think about that as a simulation of reality rather than association alone. And so to recap Dietrich's position, we have these random, unfiltered, and bizarre thoughts being generated by the spontaneous part of top cortex. And so we can consider randomness and bizarreness. I mean, randomness is fairly easy to measure, but bizarreness is very tricky to measure. What is actually meant by bizarreness is something we should all be very carefully reflecting on in all dreaming, mind-wandering, and normal consciousness uses of it. And we can think about those things as a result simply of complexity, not of any kind of inherent structure. That things could end up being that way simply because there's enough associations, enough enough predictions and interlinks between content to create this sense of randomness or bizarreness. And then we're thinking about them being unfiltered just means that they haven't been evaluated by anything. They are generated in a task-independent context. So what happens if we think about association? Think about simulation as a special kind of association that just has a directionality to it. That there's some sense of causation in a prediction where there is not in an association. And that's not to say that things can only happen in one direction, because you can predict in the past or you can predict in the future. It is bidirectional. But that doesn't mean that there isn't richness and potential in this directionality. Then we have this idea that the system of simulation could be just as rich, providing the bizarreness and the complexity of an associative system, simply because in order to learn what's most likely to happen next, you by definition have to learn what's not likely to happen next. So that same learning, that same mechanism of prediction could be doing both telling you what is most likely and telling you what is least likely. And by telling you what is least likely, it's getting towards this more bizarre possibilities of dream structures. And so, what is the function of association is a big question. And so, if the function of association is simply to apply previous learning to new contexts, that is, by analogy, then perhaps there's some other mechanism that can provide that kind of a link. And I think that link could be abstraction itself. So then the question is whether abstraction plus prediction can replace association in Dietrich's model and perhaps in other contexts. What do I mean by abstraction? So when I first started this project, I was wondering to myself, okay, I have to make a machine that sees out of a camera and it makes a dream. Well, what are the pieces of a dream? What is a dream actually made of? What are the atoms of experience? And so there's no real single answer to that because there is no individual unitary pieces of any conscious experience. Things are much more diffuse than that. And so we have this idea of a percept versus a concept. A percept tends to be a little bit more sensory oriented, like a particular image of a specific dog, versus a concept which is much more abstract and divorced from that sensory reality where it's just the notion of a dog. And you can use that concept in isolation of any context. And so for me, abstraction is the ability to suppress differences in order to emphasize similarities. So you're seeing two trees walking through the forest. Those trees might be completely unique. In fact, everything is probably unique if you're really paying enough attention to it. So if everything's actually unique, how do we say that they're the same? And we say they're the same by pretending that these differences, they don't matter, they're insignificant. Let's suppress those. But these things, they're tall, they tend to be cylindrical, they have branches, are really important, so we're going to reinforce those. And if you're going to be doing a trail run through the forest, you don't really care how unique the individual trees are. You need to be focused on what you're actually doing. So abstraction is a way of optimizing representations so they only hold enough information for what you need to be doing. And so that leads into Marceau's proposal of perceptual symbol systems theory, which is a theory that says concepts aren't something fixed in the brain, but concepts are actually simulations that are built out of sensory information in order to suit a particular task domain. And so in the case of mind-wandering dreaming, where we're by definition independent of the task domain, what would constrain and drive these processes of simulation? I don't know. So I'd like to end on this thought of what is the relationship between simulation and core cognition. And so if we do replace association with prediction, then we can read Dietrich's theory of creativity as the sensor-oriented cortical areas at the top are constantly predicting possible futures. And those possible futures can range from anything from bizarre to plausible. These predictions are modulated both by intentional control from prefrontal cortex executive processes, but also from external stimulus. External stimulus is driving this process continuously at the same time. And so our cultural obsession with narrative, the fact that we are so interested in entertainment and in fact we in some ways build our own ways of thinking about the world through our narratives and through our cultural productions, that perhaps this piece of why narrative is important is because it's actually intrinsically part of how we make sense of the world. And I mean that on a neurological level. For an artist, maybe it's obvious, or a social scientist, maybe it's obvious that we construct our world through our engagement with our culture. That it's not a perfect representation of our sensory information, but we bring our expectations to every experience that we have in the world. And so I think this place of the narrative and prediction and considering simulation as a core aspect of cognition is somewhere where artists and humanities researchers and neuroscientists can all collaborate to try and look at different aspects of what these things mean in order to build a richer and more broad knowledge base of dreaming, reality, and so on. And of course, humor and spectacle would have absolutely no meaning if they weren't, by definition, violating your predictions. Something is a spectacle or a magic trick because it's violating what you expect to happen. Something becomes funny because you thought things were going in one direction and they turned out to go somewhere else. So maybe prediction is this thing that is permeating all aspects of cognition. We just don't usually think about it that way. Thank you.